Mr. Thomas. He has over 30 years of leadership experience in the design of human tissue donation programs. He earned his Bachelor's of Science degree from Newman College in 1987 and obtained certifications from the American Society of Clinical Pathology Technologist and a certification from the National Certification Agency of Medical Laboratory Personnel as a clinical laboratory scientist. In 1988, Mr. Thomas was certified by the Eye Bank Association of America as an eye bank technician, and in 1995 he was certified by the Association of Tissue Banks as a tissue bank specialist, as the assistant director at the USC Doheny Eye, served as the executive director until 1998. The position at the Gift of Life Donor and Organ Preservation Services, a Gift of Life donor program. Jeff has worked with NDRI for 12 years and is a member of the team. He works with key personnel to identify and engage new State Medical Center. He then completed postgraduate pathology and neuropathology at Yale University. Years as a pathologist in the Centers for Disease Research or Disease. He has served on the faculty of multiple medical school and the university. In 1986, Dr. Pearl joined the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York as the director of neuropathology division and professor of neurosciences. He recently on the long-term effects of repeated NFL football players and other athletes with the Boston University Center for Study of Traumatic and has won numerous as a medical peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and as well as a highly regarded major textbook on neuropathology. And we also have Dr. Zelke with us. He received his Bachelor of Science from University of Illinois with a major in chemistry and received his PhD in biochemistry in 1968 from Michigan State University. In 1971, he accepted a postdoctoral position with John Littlefield in genetics unit of the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. In 1973, Dr. Zelke accepted the position of assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Dr. Zelke's primary research focus was involved energy metabolism in mammalian cells, particularly in the brain. Additional studies have focused on multiple metabolic aspects of sudden infant death syndrome, as well as the lack of a role of fetal hemoglobin in SIDS, and research on the role of adenosine receptor in respiratory control and energy metabolism in the brain. Dr. Zelke is currently the Division Chief of Pediatric Brain Research and has been the Director of the Brain and Tissue Bank at the University of Maryland since 1991. The Brain and Tissue Bank is the primary pediatric brain bank in the United States for developmental disorder, and over 1,100 researchers in 26 countries rely on tissue distributed from the bank. Over 850 publications have been published based on the use of tissue from the bank. All right, so we will start with an introduction to NDRI and these programs with Jeff, and then we will continue with Dr. Pearl, and then finish with Dr. Zelke with time at the end for questions.
Okay, so I'll give you a quick update regarding NDRI. I think many of you are familiar with NDRI overall. Our mission statement remains true to pretty much its origins, but we exclusively focus on providing human biospecimens to advance biomedical and bioscience research throughout the world. We are a nonprofit organization. We have funding through the National Institutes of Health for greater than 30 years. We provide over 6,000 biospecimens per year to scientists, and then we also have a metric where publications as a result of the use of those specimens number about 200 annually for us. We were founded in 1980. Just a little tidbit, we started as the National Diabetes Research Interchange, work with organ procurement groups to collect human pancreas for the emerging field of islet cell transplant therapies. We were successful at developing those relationships and soon changed diabetes to disease so that we could basically serve scientists in all aspects of human disease. Our funding through the NIH, the core funding comes from the Office of the Director through the Office of Research Infrastructure Programs. Then there's sub funding through various, and this is known as and it runs in 5-year cycles. So we, you know, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but we are an organization that only identifies eligible donors for active projects and protocols that we have on a day-to-day basis. So we had a lot of researchers questioning us about procurement of human brain, but unless they're a registered project, we would not pursue those collections. And then we basically started increasing or scaling up the number of human brain collections as a result of a project called GTEx, which is a Genotype Tissue Expression Project, which we partnered with 5 organ and tissue procurement organizations to capture multiple samples from a single donor. However, one of the funders for that project, it was an NIH Common Fund project, was the Mental Health Institute, and they're concerned with the lack of number of donors with eligible brains. So we really increased our emphasis on the tissue donor recoveries that our OPO partners were conducting to see if, in fact, we could collect GTEx samples plus brain on those donors, and were successful. So one of the elements of the GTEx project was an ethical, legal, social implication study, and part of that, when we made the decision to pursue donors for brain donation, was to determine whether or not the family decision makers, what their opinion of that was. So through surveys that were conducted on GTEx donors and the decision makers themselves, there we added questions specific about brain donation, and virtually none of those decision makers objected to contributing to the brain for the GTEx project. We, in the short term, have added 2 additional ALS projects. One's funded through the Veterans Administration in Boston, and the other is through the CDC. And we are basically collecting brain and various neurologic tissues on pre-registered ALS patients that are participating in those 2 projects. We've done a number of projects where we've actually authorized the collection of brain from an individual deceased donor, but then also had an extended authorization through one of our partners to collect buccal swabs from extended family members. So I'm just trying to give you a little bit of overview of the types of projects that we do see. So then this call today is focused on specifically the NIH Autism and Normal Control, as well as the military TBI project. These are the organ procurement partners that we've been working to basically designate the recoveries for us. So you can see the red stars represent active or programs that have actually signed on and are either near or actively screening, and then the yellow are programs we're in discussions with at this point in time to finalize those agreements. One of the things that's interesting is that we think we have, with these partnerships, a novel way to identify potential eligible candidates, because each of these programs have really a narrow eligibility, one obviously having the requirement to be an active military veteran, the other being autism and or an individual that dies within the ages of 2 to 18 are all really less frequently seen individuals in our population. So with the 9 participating sites that we have active or near activation, there's almost 91 million population or populations served by the donor service areas within those groups. Then within those groups, the additive value of the number of acute death referrals that come in through the acute health institutions is almost, you see 750,000 individuals that we have the potential to screen for specific and or unique donor eligibility profiles. So one of the challenges, we started screening for autism, actively screening for autism right around Thanksgiving of last year. Took us some time to build up the momentum with the sites in terms of the authorization training, recovery training, and things like that. But we've had between the autistic cases as well as the 2 to 18-year-old controls, we're finding that a lot of the cases are impacted by the medical legal system. So medical examiner and coroner issues were starting to arise. So one of the thoughts was to kind of create the forum where we could get the investigators for each of the projects together so that they could talk more about their projects and the services that are offered in terms of the availability to do a neuropath and the scope of that neuropath report. So I guess the goal for today is to provide more information about both projects, which each Dr. Pearl and Dr. Zelke will do, to define basically the stakeholders. So our recovery agencies that are authorizing and recovering are the organ procurement organizations, but then share with you all the importance of this effort, and then basically kind of go through a general process flow, detail the pathology reports, and then have an open discussion about what could we do better. Because one of the things that is really hurting us right now from a success standpoint is not the family's interest in contributing. It's more that the donors, for our autism project, the average age is 19 years of age, and we're finding a significant hurdle with the clearance through the medical legal system. So hopefully this will give those of you from the organ procurement side more information to talk to the medical examiners about why this is important and what we can do to help them perform their job, but then also if there are individual medical examiners on the call, that they would actually have a chance to actually ask questions of the principals. So I'm going to turn it over first to Dr. Dan Pearl and then Ron Zelke thereafter, and they'll describe their projects, and afterwards we'll have questions that we can answer for you.
Okay, so this is Dan Pearl, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this. And I'm going to describe to you this partnership we have with NDRI for what we call the USUHS CNRM Brain Tissue Repository to support research on military traumatic brain injury. Work for the military, so we have all these acronyms to deal with. Sorry. If we can have the next slide, please. And this project really deals with the problem of traumatic brain injury in the military. As you can see from this slide, in the last 15 years, a total of 344,000 episodes of traumatic brain injury have been recorded among our military personnel. This slide is a little misleading in that the way the military counts traumatic brain injury is that once these are individuals who've had a TBI, not numbers of TBIs. So once you've had a TBI, you've been counted, and then you cannot be counted again. So we have over 300,000 individuals in the military who've had a TBI. 82% of them are considered to be mild, but a mild TBI for the military, as you can see in the lower part of this slide, is loss of consciousness, it's LOC, of up to 30 minutes, period of post-traumatic amnesia of up to 24 hours. So these, by civilian standards, are fairly significant TBIs. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. The next indicates that, interestingly, of individuals who enlist in the military, and of course we have a career military now, people stay in for years. By the time they enlist, about 50% have already experienced one TBI before starting their military career. But once they're in, about 80% of all the TBIs experienced by active duty service members occur off the battlefield. At least that's the estimates that have been provided. And these are the usual kinds of things: participation in contact sports, motor vehicle accidents, falls, fights, etc. Not something that necessarily occurs on the battlefield. But the particular area that we're interested in are the TBIs that occur on the battlefield, and by and large, the vast majority of them are related to this particular weapon, namely improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, or a similar version of this in terms of suicide bombs. These are relatively inexpensive to construct, and they require little training to put them together. They're typically detonated by remote detonators using cell phones, and they're very effective, responsible for at least 60% of battlefield casualties. And the question is, what does exposure to high explosives such as an IED do to the human brain? It's a question that you would think we'd have a lot of data on and answers on, but relatively little study had been carried out looking at both the acute and long-term effects of exposure to high explosives in the human brain. Next. Now, we do know that following exposure to high explosives, military personnel often suffer from persistent, what are called post-concussive symptoms. These include headache, sleep disturbance, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, personality changes, depression, and a number of other changes in mood and personality. TBI is also closely linked to the development of what's referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which is a common psychiatric problem among post-deployment service members. In addition, military personnel post-deployment also have a high incidence of drug abuse and suicide, and how these problems are linked to prior TBI is unclear. So we currently don't understand the nature of all these rather common neurologic and psychiatric problems among individuals who've had experience with TBI in the military, particularly these battlefield blast-related injuries. And looking at this, the major barrier to greater understanding of the effects of TBI is the lack of available brain specimens for scientific study. So when I arrived at the Uniformed Services University, which is a medical school that is run by the Department of Defense, I obtained support from the Department of Defense to develop this brain tissue repository studying military traumatic brain injury. It's the only such repository specifically dedicated to supporting this research on military TBI. Okay. It's a state-of-the-art facility. I had been involved in brain banking for 25 years prior to arriving here. So based on that experience, I developed this. Over the past 20 years, as I'm sure you are aware, brain donations to similar brain banks have greatly assisted in our current knowledge of diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And they have led to advances in our ability to diagnose these conditions and to treat them. Similarly, you're probably aware of progress being made in terms of identifying and characterizing the CTE, the disease among former contact sport athletes such as new NFL football players. This is all based on similar donation programs. Next. Thank you. So in a similar fashion, we want to make sure that current and former service members and their families are aware of the existence of this CNRM Brain Tissue Repository, and let them know that brain donation is critical to solving this very important health problem for the military. Our experience has been that active duty and former service members and their families, once they learn about us, are very eager to consider the opportunity for brain donation and contribute towards reducing suffering of their fellow comrades. And they're well aware of these persistent problems and are very anxious to contribute towards finding solutions to this. Now, you may be aware, may not be aware, that 2 weeks ago we published a major paper on a finding of in the brain of service members exposed to blast exposure. This is for the first time a specific and distinct lesion has been found in individuals who've been exposed to primarily these IEDs. It's received a great deal of press and commentary, both in the military and the lay press. And this was all based on brain donations. It's a relatively small number of cases, and obviously additional cases will be needed, but it may well be that you'll find that families you talk to have heard about this study or heard about us and the work we're doing. Next. Just to show you, I mean, this is an example of some of the slides from that study. On the right-hand side, you see the slides from blast TBI cases. On the left-hand side, using the same procedures, impact TBI, that would be civilian automobile accidents and things like that. And you see that they look very different. And this is the kind of findings that we're reporting on, and we're looking to extend with by receiving additional cases. Next. So this paper is now being widely reported in the lay media. I'm getting requests for interviews and almost on a daily basis. It's been widely discussed and very positively received by service members, veterans, and their families. Whenever we speak about it, we talk about the essential part that brain donation played in doing this kind of research. It's important to point out that we're not the group studying athletes, CTE and athletes. That's a different group. They don't have any connection to the work we're doing. We're dedicated to investigating the effects of military TBI among former and active duty service members. So how does this work? Basically, through NDRI, we're working through the organ procurement organizations to screen next of kin of deceased individuals to identify those who are either current or former military service members. By that we mean individuals who are serving or did serve in the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. The ages at which we will accept specimens are between 18 and 65. But combat experience is not necessary. We do need to look at controls who have not had combat experience, and prior TBI is not necessary, again, because we need to look at controls. If individuals qualify here, then the next of kin is asked if they're interested in making brain donation to support research on military TBI. And as I say, our experience has been that they are recognize the opportunity to make a contribution in this way, and they're usually quite receptive to this concept. The brain specimen is obtained and shipped via quick. Want to receive because they have wider utility. Once the specimen is received, it's completely documented. Portions are frozen, portions are fixed for morphologic studies. A complete diagnostic neuropathology report is issued on every specimen. it's de-identified, so all the researchers cannot check back in terms of who the identity of the individual is. And we also ask that consent be given so that we can examine the clinical records and service records of our donors. And then the specimens are cataloged and then are made available to researchers. Next, I want to say a few words about the diagnostic neuropathology report. Obviously, again, as you heard, frequently this involves the medical legal system, and there are needs for these kinds of diagnostic reports. They're prepared under my supervision. I am a neuropathologist with over 40 years of experience, a great deal of experience working with medical examiners, and we make these reports available with what I refer to as an efficient turnaround time. Typically, make them available within a month. Sometimes you get a more complicated case, but typically we can get them out within a month. They include a complete growth description with high-resolution photographs of the specimen, complete microscopic exam with photomicrographs if there are relevant lesions, and then a full neuropathology diagnostic assessment of the case. If we have findings that are of clinical relevance, then an interpretation is provided, and literature citations when needed are also given. So it's a very complete report that should fill the needs of any medical legal requirement in terms of documenting what's present. I think that's most of what, I wanted to say. What's the next? Have Dr. Zelke continue, and then we'll take questions?
Exactly, yes. Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Okay, sure.
All right, great.
Well, hello. NIH has funded a brain and tissue bank at the University of Maryland since 1991. For most of our existence, we were called the NICHD Brain and Tissue Bank. Next slide, please. In 2014, NIH wanted to make it easier for researchers by combining basically 6 brain banks into a virtual brain bank so that the researchers would only go to one site to ask for tissue. Our bank at the University of Maryland focuses primarily on pediatric disorders. Next. And as you can see, there are some very big names there, Harvard and Sepulveda, which is the VA center in LA and the like. So the mission of the bank is to provide a mechanism by which families can donate tissue for research, and also to provide researchers access to human tissue. Now, many of our researchers have developed animal models, and they have absolutely no idea how to get hold of human tissue for research. So having a central bank like the NICHD Brain and Tissue Bank is extraordinarily important, and obviously we want to accelerate research to improve treatment, cure, and prevention of developmental and neurological disorders. Next, please. So in 2015, NDRI and NIH reached an agreement to approach families with autism of any age and young controls for tissue donation, because even though we are working very hard at trying to get that population, we have not been as successful as research demands, and we have not been able to supply all the researchers with tissue. Once NDRI collects the cases, it's the fresh tissue is shipped to us for processing. Next, please. So the medical examiners are absolutely critical. They have been the only source of normal control tissue that we have collected in our 25 years. And this holds especially true for children, because in our state, and most other states, any child that dies comes under the auspices of the medical examiner or coroner. Medical examiners are also critical for study of disorders where the patient dies suddenly, like in autism. 80% of all of our autism cases have been referred to us through medical examiners. Now, some medical examiners may have some concerns about working with a brain bank, but we have been working with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner here in Baltimore since 1991 and have collected 1,100 some cases, and we haven't had any problems. We provide neuropathology report and the like. So the total number that we've collected is 3,700. So about 30% of all of our cases have come from one medical examiner office here in Baltimore. Next slide, please. So Dr. Pearl has already presented how he generates a neuropathology report, and that's exactly the same way what we do here. We have 2 board-certified neuropathologists connected with the Brain and Tissue Bank. Now, once the tissue arrives here, which is then actually a separate process from the procurement of the brain, we contact the families for access to medical records. We do toxicology, serology, and then we check the quality of the tissue for RNA stability and quality and the like before we can supply it to researchers. But the medical examiner will get a neuropathology report when approximately 1 month after we receive the brain. Next, please. Now, this slide again stresses that medical examiners make autism research possible. We attend the NAME meeting, and we have a big poster with this drawing. So we work with medical examiners throughout the United States, although primarily here in Baltimore, and we ask for their help. And since we have limited capabilities to interact with a large number of medical examiners on a sort of constant basis or train them for the procurement of the tissue that we need, we are relying on the NDRI to fill this mission. Next, please. Now, our bank is extraordinarily important to researchers throughout the world. Our bank has supplied tissue to researchers in 26 countries. Most of it is shipped into the U.S., but we have an outreach throughout. So we have a tremendous reputation internationally as far as being a source of human tissue for research. May I have the next slide? Okay, so we have collected some 3,500 cases, but of these only 60 have been confirmed to be autistic. So although the total autism cases are 2% of the total tissues that we have, 8% plus another 8% of control, so basically 16% of all the tissue that we ship out from our bank is related to autism research. And although we've shipped tissue to over 1,000 researchers, over 136 are autism researchers. Again, we have hundreds of different disorders, but only 13% of these are autism researchers, and 168 papers have come out. Now, you have to think that we only have 60 cases, and we have to subdivide the brain into many, many small regions to send it out to these 136 researchers. And so we don't have an awful lot of tissue left. And what has made it worse, that there was a freezer. There was one other program that had autism tissue at the Harvard Brain Research Center, but they lost their freezer back in 2012. So we have been the only source for frozen autism tissue in the whole world. And as you can imagine, we are getting very, very depleted and need additional tissue donations. May I have the next slide? The final slide really is that some diseases are uniquely human and ultimately require study of human tissue. You can develop an animal model, but animals are not humans. Many of the studies that you find in animals do not actually translate back into humans. They are a good start for doing studies that you can't do in humans, but human tissue is absolutely necessary. And we are at a point where we desperately need autism tissue and pediatric controls in order to continue research on this devastating disorder. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Zelke. I guess we'll open up to the floor for any questions anybody has.
This is Angie Hockman. I have a question for Dr. Zelke. Why is it that you have to use why do you have to use pediatric controls for the tissue?
Okay. We are able to obtain adult controls here locally. We are not short on adult controls, but what we're really short on is pediatric controls. And many of our autism cases, until relatively recently, were under the age of 20. Now that autism has been established as a diagnosis, some of our autism cases are starting to run into the 20s and 30s. But the controls for the 20 and 30-year-olds we can obtain here in Baltimore. But what we're really short on are the pediatric controls. We have 18, but you know, it's very difficult to get a pediatric control at 8 or 12 or 6. One, they're very rare, and families are more difficult to approach, at least in our own experience at that time frame, but mainly they're so rare.
Thank you so much.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, I guess I just have a comment. So I guess both of these projects represent two really important efforts that really require identifying eligible candidates and making sure they have the opportunity to determine whether they want to participate in the project or not. And I guess one of the things we are finding, Dr. Zelke mentioned that the identification and recruitment of autism since 1991 has been 60 candidates, and that works out to be about 2.4 per year. And just since we've started really screening, which was really just before Thanksgiving, we've seen almost 15 cases, and we've converted only 5. So I think one of the really important things as we continue to bring more organ procurement partners on board is to making sure we have a well-crafted message for the medical legal representatives in your area, so that if we do find a case and a family is interested, that we can proceed to take that basically to a recovery and ultimately fulfilling, you know, the researcher requirements. So I guess part of the reason we wanted to do this was to kind of provide more information directly from the principals for each project, but then also make a firm impression that, you know, I mean, I guess for the autism itself is we've had many individuals that have authorized permission for us to remove the brain. However, we were prevented from collecting on those brains because we were getting a medical legal rejection. And the same thing with the normal controls. So we've seen, in some cases, we see as many as 10 to, say, 20 at individual sites that we're partnering with, but we're not converting any of them because of medical legal jurisdiction issues. So, I mean, part of this is as we move forward is that if, you know, in many of these families, based on what we've encountered, would have great interest in donating for brain for these various projects, because I mean, I don't think there's very many people in the United States who are not touched by, say, a neurologic condition of some sort, whether it's an early developmental disease or whether it's a degenerative disease as family members age. So I think people are familiar that this is an option and is available. It's just making sure when these unique cases, whether it's a military veteran or whether it's a young control or an autistic candidate, that we improve or do the best we can to determine whether or not people are interested in doing this. And then the next would be is making sure that the medical legal system knows there are support mechanisms within these projects to provide the information they need to give permission for us to recover.
I would just like to reiterate that we have collected 1,100 cases at the medical examiner, so it isn't as if this is a new experience, and we have been able to meet the needs of the medical exams in every one of those cases.
That's a great point. So it's really just making them aware that this can be done collaboratively. So if there's anything we can do from NDRI's perspective, we'd be potentially repeat this specifically to your local ME audience, or we could figure out ways to provide more detailed examples of what is available. But I wanted to also say is I'm really impressed with the number of people who signed on today. We're grateful for your time and listening to us, and hopefully we'll continue to move forward in a positive direction with both these projects.
So does anybody else have any questions or comments? I guess then I will just say thank you again to Drs. Pearl and Dr. Zelke for their time.